Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello everybody, Happy New Year, and to celebrate the end of 2025 and the beginning of 2026, I invited my old friend David Masciottra onto the show to get my take both on the old and the new year. Enjoy.
Welcome to Keene On. Happy New Year. This is New Year's Eve, and I've resumed my responsibilities as guest host for Andrew Keene. That's either because he's so in awe of my brilliance or because I'm the only sucker he can find who will do it pro bono. But in any event, we're going to review the year that was 2025 and also discuss what we might or might not, emphasis on might not, expect to see happen in 2026. So thank you for having me, Andrew. I remember it was...
Can I just add, David, that there is a third category, is that I enjoy talking to you and I think you're an excellent interviewer. Of course, I'm not paying you, but as you know, there's no money in podcasting. So I'm trying not to be exploitative, but of course I am.
Well, thank you for saying that, Andrew. The feeling is mutual. I very much enjoy speaking with you. And I should say I've just started a Substack, Absurdia Now, so I've joined the jackpot, as you say. But it was about a year ago that I interviewed you regarding your narrowing of the focus of your program from Keene On to Keene On America. So in this year that you've spent making a study of American history, culture, and current events, what have you learned regarding the United States that perhaps other people have overlooked? You've spoken to a wide variety of guests, and I'm sure you have some insight to share.
Yeah, it's a good question, David. I'm not sure I would describe it as narrowing. In fact, if anything, America's everything and everywhere. So in a way, I've enlarged the focus. I think what I've learned is that, and maybe this comes back to 2025, is that American history is remarkable. It's tumultuous. Everyone's always speaking of its ending, of the crisis of democracy, of this and that. So what I've discovered in the context, at least, of American history, 2025 wasn't a particularly exceptional year. That doesn't make it unexceptional, but it doesn't stand out in comparison to other years, even relatively recent ones like 1968, where there was more bloodshed and more of a crisis of democracy, more violence, more anger, more hatred. So what I've learned is that if you want to understand America, you have to understand its complicated, tragic, but also exuberant history.
Do you think that too many people are falling into the trap of believing and arguing that we live in exceptional times, everything is the best or the worst we've ever seen? And if so, why do you think that is?
The first question is easy to answer. Absolutely. I mean, it's astonishing how many people seem to almost enjoy what they see as the crisis of our age. I get lots of New Year greetings from people saying, well, I hope 2026 is going to be better than 2025. And I'm not suggesting 2025 was good for everyone. It wasn't perhaps the happiest year in American history, but it wasn't the unhappiest either. And I think there's this glee in being miserable. And I think it particularly is a reflection perhaps of my generation, of the boomer class, who are nostalgic, perhaps most of all for their youth or for an America that no longer exists, wanting to go back to something that probably never ever existed, but exists in their mind. So yeah, I think most people, or not most people, but many people are deeply pessimistic and seem to get some sort of pleasure out of misery, particularly other people's miseries, but perhaps their own. I don't think that things are that bad in America. I mean, maybe it's easy for me to speak as someone living in San Francisco, relatively prosperous, healthy, happy, blah, blah, blah. But I'm struck with the artificial misery that particularly the coastal elites seem to have created, particularly obviously in the context of Trump. I'm certainly no fan of Donald Trump, but I don't think I don't think that a lot of the misery is justified.
Well, then let's look at that from a different angle. Then you're always bringing good cheer when I'm on your program, Andrew. Uh, all the conversations you had in 2025, all of the events that you reviewed, what does genuinely concern you? You may not think that it's misery, but there has to be something that worries you about the United States at the end of 2025 moving into 2026.
Yeah, that's a good question. And just to remind our viewers and listeners, we do a daily show. So some people think that's perhaps a bit much, but it keeps me busy. It's a good structure to have. And there's so many interesting people to talk, not just about America, but about the world. I'd say two or three things particularly worry me. Trump worries me. I don't think he's a fascist. I don't think he has successfully or will successfully to destroy democracy. But his willful cruelty particularly disturbs me. The fact that he gets such pleasure out of making people he doesn't like miserable. That's the first thing that worries me. The second thing is inequality. I think that America is increasingly, if not a feudal state, certainly a medieval one, in that the reality of the wealthy, the 5 or 10% of people who live on the coast, who live very well, who live in a globalized environment, and everyone else is increasingly disturbing. Their lives are entirely different. I mean, America is premised on the unity of its population, the fact that everyone shares not just an identity and a language, but a way of life. That has always been a bit of a delusion, but it was much less of a delusion in the 1950s or 60s, 70s, even 80s than it is today. So I think that's the second thing. And the third thing, I think, is a generational problem. The way in which there seems to be, if not a generational war, deep mistrust between generations. I know my generation is very contemptuous to young people. And I know that young people are increasingly disturbed and disappointed with the performance of their elders and view America as a place where they don't have opportunity. I'm not sure all those things are necessarily true, but the generational divisions, I think, are disturbing. On the other hand, they also have the seeds of change. And I think that for America to really change, younger Americans have to grasp the nettle, have to seize the flag and change the world.
Yeah, on that inequality point, the New York Times ran a pretty stunning report yesterday or the day before yesterday. Half of consumer spending in the United States is a result of the top 10% of income earners. So you're certainly correct to feel worried. That's not sustainable.
Well, you say it's not sustainable, David. It's one of the things that I often wonder about. People say, well, that's not sustainable. It's been going on now for 10, 15, 20 years. And every year people say it's not sustainable, and it's sustained. So I'm not convinced it's not sustainable. The question is whether you're going to have political movements which will challenge it in a coherent way and in a way that can actually change things. We are seeing the beginnings of some interesting initiatives, particularly taxation initiatives. I know in California and on the East Coast, taxing wealthy people. I'm not sure whether that will dramatically change everything. I mean, the big issue, of course, is the architecture of capitalism, the way in which it lends itself to this increasing inequality and the disappearance of a middle class.
Well, One of the things that surprised me about 2025, I don't know how much it surprised me actually, uh, disappointed me about 2025, as long as we're on the topic of miseries, was the comparative lack of response from the general public to the Trump administration, in contrast to what we saw during his first term. There was a much greater popular response in opposition to Trump policies in 2017 than there was in 2025. Do you agree with that? And if so, what do you think accounts for that difference?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, you did have the No Kings movement this year, which brought hundreds of thousands of people out in their streets demonstrating against him. You may be right, but one reason to actually be cheerful about that is because I think people are already bored of him. We've done a number of shows on why 2025 represents peak Trump, and I think that's right. I think people are already bored of him, which explains why he makes more and more outrageous claims. And every time he appears on media, which seems all the time because he has his own platform now, Truth Social, he says increasingly outrageous things. I think people are bored. I think his shtick has got really repetitive and predictable. Every time there's any kind of economic bad news, for example, he comes out with something incredibly outrageous, accusing one group or other of cannibalism or some other absurd idea. So I think people are bored, and I think they're also bored in the sense that they're not clear what the alternative is. There's no alternative within the Republican Party, or if the alternative is a kind of J.D. Vance Trump light. The Democrats are in a state of profound disarray. The old left, Bernie Sanders, hasn't really been replaced. So I think people are waiting to see what will appear. I mean, if the next election, the next presidential election is between, for example, Gavin Newsom and J.D. Vance, I think people will scratch their heads and say, for all this MAGA revolutionary or reactionary moment, not much has changed. So I'm not convinced that it's necessarily a bad thing. I also think it speaks of a kind of weird phenomenon in America where Trump claims to be doing really bad things. And he shows off about that in terms of his cruelty. But I don't think he really is. I think for the most part, not that much has changed. So he's the reverse of most traditional presidents who often do rather unpleasant things, but deny it or pretend that these things have nothing to do with them. Trump claims all evil, which makes him a bizarre, very much of a 21st century social media or reality television president.
Changing the subject rather awkwardly, unless you want to go on about Trump.
No, I definitely don't. I think that's the other thing is, and I try and limit the conversation on my show. I think we talk much too much about it.
That's probably for the best. I mean, it has become a bit dull and predictable. You have written several books chronicling the changes in technology that are increasingly dominant of culture and economy, one of which is the cult of the amateur, which we discussed in a previous episode. What about AI or any other tech development interested you most in 2025, and are you keeping your eyes set on for 2026?
Well, the obvious one is AI. I think we're at the end, or perhaps even 2024, 2023 mark the end of our social media age. The new age is one of AI. And I'm much more ambivalent than I was on the previous social media Web 2.0 revolution. Of course, AI has many, many critics, including lots who've been on my show, like Gary Marcus, who's been a frequent guest, an old friend, and very articulate critic, not just of generative AI, but of open AI in particular. for me personally, it gives me great powers in terms of editing, developing my show, distributing my show. So I'm ambivalent about AI. I mean, I recognize the problems. I recognize the fact that some of these companies like Anthropic, which I like, are stealing our content. In fact, just before we did the show, I got an email from my literary agent suggesting that in this big trial against Anthropic, I can claim because they've stolen some of my content. But at the same time, it's remarkably empowering. I imagine as an author, as a podcaster, as a writer, I'm experiencing something like an early 19th century person did when they first saw and rode on a train. This remarkably different world, much more power. It's certainly the most dramatic thing in tech terms for me personally since email. And it's changing my life as much as email did, more than the web.
You sounded a bit villainous just now, Andrew, boasting of your great powers, but we'll leave that aside.
I'm not sure if I was boasting, but yeah, I take the point.
What you suggested that we talk about what did not happen in 2025. People are always making predictions. What did not happen in 2025 that you perhaps thought would happen, or that everyone predicted would happen and you were correct in assessing that it would not?
Yeah, I don't want to claim that I got it and nobody else did. But I've always been very, very skeptical of this idea of the death of American democracy. And I think 2025, without wanting to bring Trump back up again, I think reflects reasonably well on American democracy. It stood up well under the assault of Trump's sort of legalistic assault on different kinds of institutions. A lot of people talked about Doge being the end of the American state. That didn't happen either. It was mostly a failure. So I don't think it was as dramatic a political year as some people believe, or certainly believed. I also think on the tech front, AI is powerful. It offers a great deal of potential. It's certainly not perfect. And we're nowhere near AGI. We're nowhere near machines that are better than human intelligence. So I think a lot of the stuff that's been said or promised on AI didn't get realized in 2025 either.
Well,
the other thing I would, again, coming back to this note of pessimism, you and I are both movie fans. I've seen many, many good films this year. Now, the recent news has been about this competition between Paramount and Netflix to acquire Time Warner. I'm not sure it's necessarily good news, particularly for those people like you and I who enjoy going to the cinema. But the idea of the death of the movies or the death of culture or of publishing also is a perennial complaint and is never realized. I thought 2025 was an excellent year for the movies. It was also an excellent year for books. I mean, I've had literally hundreds of guests on my show with new books, most of which have been very interesting and original. So I think it was as good a year for culture as any other.
And I would add it was also a great year for music. It was a great deal of creative and dynamic music in a variety of genres that came out in 2025. I think that part of it is that what is mass marketed has certainly become narrower and a bit more objectionable. But
yeah, but also
it's out there though. You just have to look for it.
There's always this sort of nostalgia for an age. Oh, well, everyone liked the Beatles or everyone liked a major artist. I'm not sure that was necessarily a good thing. There was a show on the Beatles this year or another podcast that I listened to. I'm not convinced that they were quite what their admirers imagined them to be. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think 2025, if it's going to be remembered for everything, for anything, is the year where nothing actually happened, where there was all these dangers and promises and fears, but it was a relatively forgettable year. I mean, you and I are talking on New Year's Eve, so we're almost done with the year. I'm not saying that we should be glad to be done, but I think we got out of it relatively lightly. There were no major disasters. I mean, again, it goes without saying, if you live in Gaza or Ukraine, it's a different story. And we've done a lot of stories on that as well, and the dysfunctionality of the international system and these wars these ongoing wars that aren't being fixed. So I'm not celebrating that either. But I think mostly 2025 is a year where not that much happened, or what most people feared didn't transpire.
I would add that domestically, if you are a Latino, and especially if your immigration status is questionable, 2025 was probably pretty traumatic and catastrophic.
Yeah, that goes without saying. But
Yeah.
I don't want to have a debate on the immigration thing. When you say when your immigration status is questionable, meaning that you should be in the country, I mean, it's the one thing that most people on the left and right seem to agree on, that
Oh no, because
it's a problem that America, I mean, Trump hasn't addressed it in a humane way, but it's certainly a problem that should or has to be addressed.
I used questionable quite deliberately because many people have been caught up in this ICE deportation machine, or here on green cards or visas, or legal residency status. So it's not entirely illegal immigrants, but even if it were, I would argue we should still treat them with some
yeah, I mean,
humanity.
that comes back to Trump and his overt vindictiveness.
Yes.
And the fact that I think a majority of Americans actually seem, especially when it comes to the immigration issue, seems to celebrate that. So it's not just him. It reflects actually rather badly on the country.
Yes, I agree with you. So since we didn't want to get into the disappointments and miseries and pessimism, even if you're correct that 2025 was rather uneventful, what about the year, other than the high quality films that we saw in the theaters, pleased you?
Well, what pleased me, as rephrasing what I said earlier, that American democracy stood up well to the threat of Trump and MAGA, that the courts have stood up well, that even the Supreme Court, which some people seem to have written off as a MAGA agency, which I certainly don't buy, has begun to distance himself. So I think American constitutionalism has won out, or at least appears to have won out in 2025. Also, the country seems to be slowly shifting its opinion. The elections this year weren't kind to Trump, and one can only hope that 2026 will continue with this. So the fact that America has survived and remains the most dynamic economy in the world, I think is something to celebrate.
On that note, I'm sure, given that you have a daily show, you're inundated with predictions for 2026, or at least something that will occur in the near future, politically, culturally, economically, technologically. What predictions have you heard that you do not think will come to fruition in 2026? What is everyone waiting, expecting to happen, but you think they're just going to continue to wait?
Yeah, I wonder whether there's going to be a sharp shift in the Democratic Party. I mean, people take it for granted that the Democrats will respond to Trump and come up with their own maybe progressive version of populism. But I heard an interview with Gavin Newsom by Ezra Klein on the New York Times podcast, and I was really struck with what a traditional politician he is. And if he really is indeed the leading candidate for the 2028 presidential election, and now has become at least the unofficial voice of the opposition, then I don't think that much has changed within the Democratic Party.
Isn't part of Newsom's claiming of that mantle the fact that aren't there two reasons for that? One, that he's telegenic, and that's always been important in American politics. And second, that he's the one who's doing it. I mean, there really aren't many Democratic figures with his kind of cachet who are speaking with the aggression that he is. I'm not a member of his fan club either, but it seems that while many Democrats are rather bashful, he's much more aggressive. Isn't it just kind of by default that he's become something of a
Well,
leader?
if that's the case, then it doesn't reflect well on the rest of the field, because all of them have the opportunity to have their own podcast shows and appear on Ezra Klein or whoever else is getting attention. So yeah, I'm not sure that's the case, and I'm not sure he's going to win or even really is the leading candidate. We may not even know who, if there is a leading candidate, we may not even know their name right now. Most people may never have heard of them. Maybe a Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or a Barack Obama in the wings. But I'm a little bit suspicious that the Democrats will be capable of coming up with some left populism or progressive populism. I'm not sure what it looks like. I don't really understand how it gets articulated and how they separate themselves from the MAGA people. And I hope they can, because I'm not convinced that they can win the next election without some degree of populism. But it's going to be really interesting to see how it's done and who does it. I certainly don't think that some sort of white toast Midwestern male governor is going to be able to do it.
Right. Yeah. Or Kentucky's more southern than Midwest, but Andy Bashar.
Oh, you're in Illinois. Your governor, another wealthy man like Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom clearly has taken the 101 course on how to become Donald Trump.
Right.
But I'm not convinced that anyone can become Donald Trump, even Donald Trump himself, and certainly not Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, of course, you're referring to Pritzker, governor of Illinois.
Yeah.
And he, like Newsom, has adopted a very aggressive tone, which is interesting because it makes one wonder if great personal wealth is now a prerequisite for political courage.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. And perhaps the great figures on the left in 20th century American history, from FDR to JFK and Bobby Kennedy, they've all been people of wealth from the American aristocracy. I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if they can succeed, if they can win, then I'm more than happy to support them, independently of whether they'd led lives of privilege. But we're going to need to see something or someone really different, and I certainly don't see it in the person of Newsom or Pritzker even more. I mean, Pritzker doesn't even have the Hollywood looks of a Newsom. Another thing that for me we're not going to see or won't happen in 2026 is on the AI front. We won't get to AGI. There'll be lots more talk, lots more supposed breakthroughs. It's going to be an interesting year, certainly in terms of the fate of OpenAI. I'm more and more skeptical, and which big tech companies, Google, Microsoft, take up the mantle. But I'm not convinced that we're going to have an AI development that will finally convince everyone that machines are smarter than humans.
Well, you alluded to this earlier. If you study the history of technology, then you're studying warnings and people collapsing into panic. I mean, every development invites that response. from the printing press to the internet. What are some reasons? This isn't a predictive question, but we hear so much about why to fear and lament and protest AI. Why should we welcome it? Why should we celebrate it?
Yeah, and I alluded to this earlier in terms of why I'm personally excited by AI as a podcaster. I mean, you and I are doing this show not in person, but we're doing it online in person. We're not bots. We're real humans talking to one another. But having recorded this, I can use AI to summarize, to put it in forms that would take me hours, days, maybe even weeks to put together. So I think from an independent creator's point of view, AI offers enormous potential. Now, not all that potential, I guess, should be celebrated. I'm not going to be hiring editors or graphic designers or engineers to put the podcast together, but then I wouldn't have in the first place. So it gives me the power of a video, an audio video show, gives me the power of radio and television in ways that were unimaginable before. And I think in an age of media consolidation, that's something to be celebrated. I see no reason why we should fear that. We should fear the fact that the bots might put together this kind of show without you and I. But I'm not convinced that certainly that's imminent, or perhaps will ever be possible for technology. Maybe in 50 or 100 years, but in that time we'll have moved ahead and the debate will be somewhere else.
Speaking of podcasts, there was a very interesting essay in the Baffler recently. I don't know if you saw it.
No, I didn't.
In which it was a podcast host who's had quite a degree of success with it was bemoaning the rise and influence of the podcast, which made for some bipolarity there.
Classic misery, yeah.
Right. And he made the point that one of the things he doesn't like about the podcast is that it's replaced the book at the center of intellectual culture and political discourse. As someone who's been doing this now for several years, and you have every intention of doing it in 2026, what are the pros and the cons of the popularity of the podcast?
Well, I wish I had a Joe Rogan popular podcast. I don't, but I have it's a middle-class podcast in the sense that it's not it doesn't have hundreds of thousands of viewers for each show, but at the same time, it has a real audience, which is distributed in all sorts of platforms. There's no reason to bemoan podcasts. I mean, you may not like some podcasts. No one's forced to listen to them. There's such a variety. There are so many good ones, and there are even more bad ones. Your point about the book, I'm not sure if it was your point or
it was his point.
The Baffler point. I don't know who the piece was by. I mean, I've written for the Baffler, tend to be rather reactionary, especially when it comes to tech. I'm not sure that people have written off the book. We've read, ironically enough, the obituary of the book so many times. And the publishing industry is doing reasonably well. I plan to do a book. I'm in the process of writing a book, which I will spend some of 2026 and 2027 writing. I hope it'll come out in 2028. More of that on my show next year. But I don't see much evidence of that. It's not as if people were thinking of sitting down with a book and have chosen to listen to podcasts. I also think most people listen to podcasts in the gym or on walks or when they're driving. In other words, in situations where they wouldn't be reading a book. So I don't see any evidence of that, nor do I see much evidence that the book is in crisis or any more crisis than it's been in since the invention of the internet, where people have been writing its obituary. Books retain a degree of popularity. They are a niche product, but their lovers are very loyal. And I think in an age of AI and an age of increasing digitalization, reading a book, just like listening to vinyl records, will become a form of resistance, which will gain in popularity, particularly with young people.
I certainly hope that you're correct in that prediction. Looking back on your 2025, accepting me, of course, because it would be rather awkward for me to accept all of your praise, wallow in your praise. What are some of the most interesting conversations you've had? What are some of the conversations that you believe will age particularly well, especially given that you do a topical show?
There was a book written by an environmentalist. I'm going to look him up. It was called Here Comes the Sun. And it was a positive book about the environment. Bill McKibben, one of the most respected environmentalists, who has a tradition, a history of being rather pessimistic. His new book, Here Comes the Sun, suggests there's an opportunity with solar energy to actually, if not fix the environmental crisis, certainly address it. So I was struck with that.
And McKibben, before you continue, he says that everything's within our grasp. We just need the political will to do it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure he even says that. I mean, he suggests that the technology is there, and whether it happens in the US or China is the big issue.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to happen, whatever the US does. I've also enjoyed a lot of the shows on China. I find it a particularly interesting model. I think that a lot of the hostility to China, the paranoia about China and Xi and his version of totalitarianism is probably wrong. I'd actually like to go to China. I just did a show a few days ago with Chris Schroeder, Washington, D.C. based venture capitalist who's just spent some time in China and has a really interesting report. So I've really enjoyed the shows on China.
And what topics are you hoping to explore more in 2026?
It's a good question. I don't think anything new. I think we'll pursue the same things. I mean, more and more books. I think fewer and fewer books will be written about Trump. I think that the publishing industry will begin to recognize that he no longer sells. There'll be more and more books about how to reinvent the Democratic Party. I think that the abundancy debate, which was triggered by the Klein Thompson book, I don't think it was a particularly good book or even an interesting book, but it was a healthy book in the sense that it's forcing people to rethink what abundancy is and how progressives, people on the left, can actually be optimistic. So I'd like to focus on that too.
You know, you said earlier, and now you've kind of come back to it with your reference to Klein Thompson abundance, that the Democratic Party is struggling to articulate a version of politics that offers a persuasive opportunity for moving America forward. The old left seems to recycle, these terms that feel a bit outdated, labor unions, protest language, and it just doesn't feel applicable. Whereas I think we all know that the corporate third way has lost its gas. So if this isn't your jurisdiction, but if you were giving advice to the DNC, how would you suggest they consider reinventing themselves so as to better appeal to the broad sweep of American voters?
Yeah, and this is something we've given a great deal of thought to, and particularly my weekly conversations with Keith Teare, the publisher of That Was the Week, the tech newsletter, who's much more of a tech abundance theorist or progressive optimist than myself. I think that the DNC, whatever that is, it sounds very bureaucratic to me, needs to embrace technology, innovation, and business, and recognize that what was a working class now may become a leisure class and begin to think or rethink the idea of leisure and work in the 21st century, where AI will do more and more of the heavy lifting. I think falling back on the the old backstops, whether it's government or education, it all sounds very archaic and unconvincing. So again, these people who bemoan the universities, oh, we got to save the universities, we got to save education. AI changes everything. I had an experience recently. I was talking to a professor at Berkeley, someone I went to graduate school with, and they were complaining about the fact that their students refuse to read books. And they have a policy now in their class that you have to read the book. You can't use AI to summarize the book. And a student came into their office and was quite overt and said, this is absolutely ridiculous. I don't agree with your policy. I want to use AI to summarize books. And of course, he was outraged and saw it as evidence of the decline of Western civilization, the end of education, free thought, all the rest of it. But actually, I think it offers an opportunity. I mean, it comes back to my point about summarizing this conversation with AI, which can be done in about 10 seconds, which I will use to publish this show. It shouldn't be an endpoint in itself, but if indeed AI does allow you to summarize most books, not all books, because you can't summarize Shakespeare, you can't summarize Proust, you can't summarize Susan Sontag or Don DeLillo. It's not possible in AI form. But most of those books which can be summarized probably don't have that much value. If it can indeed lend itself to that student, that young woman, to think for herself in different ways, maybe not quite to read the book, but having got the AI summary to do some creative work on her own, then that's a good thing. So I think we need to just think positively about what technology can and can't do. We've been burned before. We were promised all sorts of things about the internet and social media, which didn't happen. I was one of the earliest people to warn against that. But I think the zeitgeist has shifted so sharply that if anything now, we need to remind ourselves of the potential and value of technology. I also think we should, and even the Democrats need to be a little bit more charitable when it comes to success. The billionaire now has become a form of insult. And I think people need to recognize that the system enables billionaires, and the majority of billionaires aren't evil. They're simply successful business people, successful innovators. Doesn't mean that we have to idolize them. I'm certainly no great admirer of people like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk. But we have to recognize that the prosperity in America is driven by innovation and leaders of innovation, and that being a billionaire actually, it reflects a problematic system which enables billionaires. But we shouldn't hate billionaires. We shouldn't vilify them.
Yeah, Raymond Chandler wrote in a Philip Marlowe novel that AI can summarize for those who've not yet read it, that there's no honest way to make $1 billion. Now, Chandler
he wrote that a long time ago. Do you agree? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't believe that that's any more true than $1 million.
I was going to say that I agree with you. I think that you know, the Chandler line is outstanding, but I agree with you that using billionaire as a slur is a bit lazy and stupid. And it also, I don't think it resonates with most Americans. You know, I think that another great author, John Steinbeck, had it right when he said, in America, there are no poor people, there are only temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Yeah.
For better, for worse, for good or for bad, the American people don't have resentment of wealth that exists in other societies, and trying to build a political platform around disparagement of inordinately wealthy people isn't likely to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I see no value politically or ethically in wanting to punish billionaires. I mean, it's pointless, and as you say, rather childish. At the same time, I think the Democrats do need to come up with policies that recognize inequality, and that I'm certainly in favor of some of the tax initiatives of of increasing taxes for the wealthy, whether it's the billionaire class or the people who are worth 10, 100, $500 million. But yeah, this sourness towards success, I think, I'm not necessarily comfortable with this phrase, but it does strike me as being rather un-American.
And not all billionaires are equal. So you mentioned Peter Thiel. He's someone who has quite a nefarious influence on American politics. And yet we learned yesterday or the day before that Beyonce is now a billionaire.
Yeah, I mean, your hero, Bruce Springsteen, you've written a book about him. We've done a number of shows. He's a billionaire. But my hero, Bob Dylan, he's a billionaire. So it doesn't tell you anything. Reid Hoffman, who's the principal funder of the Democratic Party, is a billionaire. So not all, certainly, there's only one, we're lucky to say, there's only one Peter Thiel. And he certainly doesn't epitomize every billionaire. It's absurd.
Well, Andrew, what in moving forward in 2026, you've given us plenty of reasons to cheer. You've given us a few reasons to weep. What do you think what are the stories that people are missing right now? You know, in all of the political prognostications that you see, you've covered AI a little bit. What do you think will happen in 2026 that might surprise people? What are people missing right now?
I'm not going to answer that, because if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. And I can't know. I don't know any more than anyone else. But what I will say is there will be surprises. Stuff will happen that we don't expect. Although, in an odd way, nothing really seemed to have happened. And looking back at, if we could go back a year and we were talking this time next year, I'm not sure we'd be necessarily surprised. Although we perhaps might be surprised with the first 100 years of the Trump administration and this sort of whirlwind assault on the state and on the law. Stuff will happen. That's the nature of history. The idea, I mean, if I had a penny for every time everyone brings up Fukuyama's End of History, I'd be a rich man. I wouldn't need to be doing this show. We're not at the end of history. We never will be. And I'm not expecting, I'm certainly not hoping for a 9/11 kind of moment, but it's just as conceivable in 2026 as it was in 2025 or 2024. It will happen, particularly, I think, on the economic front. One of the interesting shows we've been doing recently is the crypto scandal around the Trumps. And I think that that's really worth noting. If I was to predict something, I talked to Martin Wolf, the chief economics correspondent of the FT, and he compared what's happening now with crypto around the Trumps to the Teapot Dome scandal of the Harding administration in the mid 1920s. My sense is at a certain point, the corruption of, if not Trump himself, certainly of his family and of his immediate circle, will be revealed in crypto. Because I think there is a scamish quality to most of the crypto community. And at some point that will get revealed. I'm not convinced it will be in 2026. But if there is to be a crisis, an economic one, then I wonder whether it will be then. One thing that won't happen, I would predict in 2026, is a crisis around jobs and AI. That may be a feature of the later 2020s, when we all suddenly wake up and realize we don't have jobs, whether we're lawyers or accountants or engineers or academics. But I think we're still early in that cycle.
You know, that's interesting. You answered my question. I was going to rephrase to say, rather than predict an event that will occur in 2026, give us a story we should follow in 2026, and you answered very well.
I mean, it's the dirty money stuff. We've done lots of shows on dirty money. And again, I'm not suggesting that there's some dirty money alliance between the Trump family and Putin's forces in Moscow. But I think what's happening with crypto and the way in which the Trump family and even Trump himself are milking the system for instant rewards has all the features of a major financial scandal. It doesn't mean it will happen, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and that's interesting what you said about the so-called jobs crisis. I remember Mark Cuban, another billionaire.
And a good billionaire, Cuban. I saw him in the 1990s when he was just another internet entrepreneur, give a brilliant speech.
Very much so. And now he's helping people get their prescription drugs at lower prices. Brought the Dallas Mavericks back into victory a long time ago. But he predicted 20 years ago that automation would bring a crippling jobs crisis in the United States. He's a very smart man. He was wrong about that. It seems like we're replaying those kinds of cataclysmic predictions. And I think we should, it doesn't mean that we should whistle past the graveyard, but perhaps we should, cool it a little bit in expecting the apocalypse.
Yeah, I mean, that I couldn't agree more, but I think it will have very dramatic long-term implications on education. I think people who see education as the solution are wrong. It needs a different kind of education. But we're not going to see, there's not going to be a 9/11 moment or a 1929 moment in this jobs crisis. It's going to, we are literally the frogs in the boiling water, and at some point we'll realize we're cooked, but it's going to take a while. Let's end, David. Let me, you've been so generous with your time. Very brief overview for you of 2025 and something original about 2026 that I haven't talked about. What are you excited about or looking forward to?
Oh, well, you've put me on the spot, but I would say that in 2025, and this is good and bad, and it's somewhat of an echo of what you said earlier. We learned that for all of the predictions of dramatic transformations in American politics, we're still having many of the same conversations that we were having 20 years ago and we're likely to have 20 years from now. The circumstances and the details change, but I'm increasingly struck by how many of the old arguments from when I was in high school, when I was an undergraduate political science major, we're still having in some slightly altered iteration all of these years later, despite the supposed inflection points, to use one of the most popular cliches of Trump and the pandemic and everything else. So it's a hurry up and wait political culture. And in 2026, I'll shift and say, one of the things that I do at my Substack is cultural criticism, is going back to what we said earlier. Despite all of these warnings of cultural collapse and decay, and despite some signs that, of course, some of that is happening, we continue to live in a world with a very rich and vibrant and stimulating arts and publishing and journalism scene. And if someone viewing this thinks that it's all gone to hell, I would suggest use the communicative and research tools at your disposal and find that in many ways, the artistic world now is much more vibrant, it's much more diverse. There's a much greater plethora of voices doing interesting things than there was 20 years ago. So I would expect that to continue into 2026. And at the same time, we'll hear more and more about how none of that is happening and everything is getting worse.
Well, my optimism seems to have infected you, David Masciotto. Always a pleasure. Happy New Year to you, and a Happy New Year to all our listeners and viewers. It's going to be an exciting 2026 for Keen on America. We're going to be doing all sorts of things. I'll be making some announcements in January, early in the year. So a happy, healthy new year. And David, I hope all our viewers and listeners will check out your new Substack page. It's very interesting, and best of luck with everything in the new year.
Thank you. Happy New Year. Hope to talk to you again.